Okay, and then we have, of course, the question of science and genetics and biology as a place where people can turn to try to answer this is race real question. How do we, reconcile the contingent part, by which we simply mean that it can be otherwise and it's not fixed, even though it is, intentional and linked to historical processes. The attempt to get outside of that into a scientific paradigm. I mean, how do you see that response to the question of the reality of race?
Mhm. This to me is actually one of the interesting outcomes in recent research and philosophy of race. Philosophers of science, philosophers of biology, people who study population genetics, right? All those people are, and of course the scientists too, but I'm a philosopher, so I'm more familiar with those conversations. Are many people in those settings are thinking really hard about how to answer this question. They're thinking really hard about what race talk can mean for science once we realize it cannot mean what it meant for 19th century science, right? It just can't be, because genetics doesn't work like that, right? Human traits don't express themselves in the way 19th century race science thought it did, right? And so a lot of people have come around to what, once you hear it, is a perfectly sensible thing to say. One of the things we do when we sort humans into populations by appeal to generic meanings that have to do with bodies and bloodlines is that we create, in essence, this is horrible language to use when it comes to humans, but we create breeding populations, right? We tell stories about who can mate with whom and who can live with whom and who can have relationships with whom. And we govern ourselves by reference to those norms and principles. And so there is a way in which race can be both socially constructed and biological, because the social construction frames the way we manage our biology, right? It frames the way we engage in the practices that eventuate in human reproduction. And so there is a way in which race is biological. It has to be, if it's about human bodies, right? But it's not biological in the way that 19th century race scientists thought it was. And lots of really smart biologists and genetic scientists and anthropologists are talking in really sophisticated ways about this now, and thinking about just what kinds of populations, right, our social practices, our racialized social practices are bringing into being. How can we tell scientific stories about them? Stories that do not then result in invidiously racist accounts of the differences between human populations. That's a really exciting development, I think.
Hmm. And maybe, yes, thank you. And we can add a footnote here, perhaps, just to explain what we mean by social construction, because
Sure.
this is where that whipsaw effect tends to happen, from the scientific to the, well, it's just constructed and therefore it's fictive and it's not real. Maybe you can just give us your sense of how to understand the social constructed side of it.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Sorry for tossing that in without defining it. That's one of the cardinal sins of philosophy. Don't just start talking about things until you define them. So I'll go back to the thing I said earlier about the difference between rocks and trees and social categories, right? So there's stuff in the world that just is what it is without our intervention. It doesn't depend on the way we think about it. That stuff is not socially constructed. That stuff is just stuff. It's natural if you have the right account of nature. But those things are real in what strike most of us as uncomplicated senses, right? Philosophers can make anything complicated, but for most of us, rocks and trees and mountains and stuff like that is uncomplicated in its reality. But then there are things that aren't like rocks and trees that depend on human intervention and agency and intentions, right? And ideas, things like rubles, right? Things like nations, things like fill in the blank, right? Those things are not like rocks, but they govern our affairs in ways that constrain individuals, right? I can't just walk out and decide my dollar is worth $1,000. I can't do that unilaterally. But the dollar exists at all because society has constructed currency and done that kind of stuff. So there are things that are socially constructed that depend on us, but that nevertheless govern our affairs in ways that most of us find unproblematic. Race is one of the things that is socially constructed, but many people find problematic, right? We've made this thing and we've made it do really bad things, and the basis for it is really fuzzy. So why do we bother with it? We bother with it for the reason I suggested earlier, some of us, because that language allows us to track the consequences of some of the things people have done in the name of race and racism. But race is on the side of real things that money is on, that points in football games are on, right? Things that depend on our intentions and agency. And whenever you have something like that, people are going to raise questions about how real it is, whether it's real, what kind of real it is. But that's what I mean by social construction. Does that help?
It does. Thank you. Yes. And I think with that, perhaps we can shift a bit away from what we could call the metaphysical questions of what is race and is it real, to perhaps some ethical questions in terms of, when is it okay to engage in race talk and to sort or distinguish people based on race, and when perhaps is it not okay?
Good. Yeah. To be clear, the ethical questions are the ones that are at the center of the enterprise for most of us. For some of us, metaphysics is itself an essentially normative activity that has ethical questions at its heart. It is often an ethical question. Or put it differently, the question of how one will navigate the world and whether one will do it more productively and intelligently rather than less is an ethical question, and depends on what you think the world is and what's in it and what kinds of things the things that are in it are and all of that. So the ethical questions are at the heart of the enterprise. When is it okay to use race talk and that kind of stuff? So one of the challenges of ethics sometimes is that people come to our esteemed colleagues, the ethicists, looking for algorithms and solutions and hard and fast principles. And most of us, I think the ethical life is not like that, right? It's fuzzy and gray, and it is rooted essentially in what some ancient figures called phronesis, or discernment, the ability to cultivate the capacity to see the world more clearly and to navigate accordingly. So that fact of the ethical life frames the answer I will give, such as it is to your question. One has to go by appeal to the cases, right? There is no overarching 30,000 foot principle that I can offer that will sort out all the cases. When you're dealing with ethical questions like this, you're dealing with questions of ethical human interaction, right? And so the question is, what does this situation require of me? What do my fellow inhabitants of this situation require of me? What is demanded of me in this exchange? It's that kind of question. As it happens, race talk routinely generates certain kinds of conflicts like that, right? Some person called somebody else a thing that they don't want to be called because of this weird history with these words. So there are familiar and routine ethical problems that arise like this that are pretty easily sorted out, but they come down to the ethics of human interaction and responding responsibly to our fellows. So case by case, the one sort of general principle I'll give, and then I'll stop rambling, is this. Some people want to answer your question by appeal, by moving back to the metaphysics, right? They say, well, you should never use it because it doesn't mean anything, because it can't be anything. And so then anytime you use it is wrong and racist. To which I say, it will not surprise you, having heard the things I've said already, that's way too quick, right? That's way too quick, right? Not least because one of the things we can use race talk to do is the thing that I described earlier. We can use it to help us keep track of certain kinds of social patterns, right? That have to do with the distribution and maldistribution of social resources, that have to do with the systematic and patterned immiseration of certain people, right? And upliftment of others, right? So there are easy ways to use race talk that are not at all obviously problematic. It's much too quick to just say it's all racist because you're carving up the human family into different bits. That's much too quick. But sometimes people say it.
Yeah, I think you've identified two really key ethical commitments, in thinking about our use of race talk, which is, one, context always matters, and that's where you're going to find cues. And then secondly, the responsiveness to the people we're interacting with. And I think a lot of our current discourse is a willful kind of ignoring of this responsiveness to others, and that I want to say what I want to say, and that's that. And we can see the limitations of it. But the other side of it is the kind of contextual space that you've put us in thinking about race talk and responsiveness is that there's this fear of saying the wrong thing and making mistakes that can hover over the whole race talk question, even within specific contexts where I'm interacting with colleagues in a meeting, let's say. So is there anything you can illuminate about handling that fear of making mistakes, saying the wrong thing, and using race talk in a way that's going to, if not have a bad intention, but a really a bad impact on someone?
Yeah. This is hard. All of this is hard. This is a real challenge, especially these days. In ways you will know better than I, our public discourse and political discourse is flammable, and polarized in ways that are disheartening and distressing. In part for those reasons, I don't have a magic bullet answer, but I don't have that kind of answer in part just because of the nature of the enterprise and the kind of situations and dynamics we're talking about. They just don't work like that. Social life is hard, right? Managing your relationships to other people is hard. Managing their perceptions of you when you engage with them is hard. One of the things that is crucial for dealing with the particular kind of difficulty you've raised is accepting the burden of engaging our fellows as fellows, not as passing, as objects that happen to pass through our space from time to time. What do I mean? That was very abstract. What I mean is that I like the way you put it earlier, right? Sometimes people want to say whatever they say and let the chips fall where they may and do whatever because they are atomistic individuals moving through the universe in self-sufficient way. Well, no, it's not like that. If you want people to respond to you in the way that you intend, you have to create space for them to trust you as an interlocutor. You have to create space for the engagement to unfold in a certain kind of way with openness and flexibility, which is why the real answer, the better answer to the kind of question you're giving has to do with cultivating modes of practice and interaction that can inform office cultures, that can inform school cultures, that can inform the way we engage in meetings, right? There are people who specialize in this. Some of them do equity, diversity, and inclusion work. Some of them do, what do you call it when you have a conflict zone and you want people to manage their relationships afterwards? Conflict resolution work. There are concrete practices that people need to learn about, dispositions that attend those practices that people need to cultivate that allow for the kind of thing that you're talking about. We sometimes approach, especially philosophers, as if it is a conceptual problem, right? Give me the account of the way to engage that will allow this to go better. It's not like that, right? We're talking about the social equivalent of the thing our mindfulness teachers do when they engage with individuals, right? If you want to engage with someone compassionately and productively and all of that, you have to manage yourself and your impulses and your emotions and your dispositions. It's not a conceptual enterprise all the way down. So social life is like that too. And so maybe the best way to answer this question, and with all of the complexities I've just introduced to it, and I'll close with this, is to ascend to a little bit of a higher level instead of thinking about how the individual has to engage in that moment, although that's a real question. We should think also about what it takes to create social spaces where people can engage more productively, where the stakes of the mistake are not as high, right? Where there is more trust and openness so people can speak freely and be received in the ways they want. But that requires the speaker taking a burden as well, right? And being willing to inhabit the space in certain kinds of ways. This is in part what the literature on white fragility is about. I have some colleagues who are very critical of that literature for perfectly sensible reasons. But there is something really important there, right? There are lots of things that are important. One of the things that's important has to do with insisting to our potential interlocutors that they accept the burden of managing their paths through the social world. Right? Instead of moving through the social world like a bull in a china shop, I knock over whatever I want to knock over and then you got to deal with it. Accepting that there is a burden of interlocution, right? That the social and social life has to do some work.
Yes, thank you. I want to really underscore that point because I think the notion of accepting the burdens of, our social interactions really is not just important for this conversation, but seemingly where we are in our wider social and political moment and the discourses around. With that comes conception of responsibility. But I also want to flag the move that we've made from the what is race question, and you've given complex but concrete answers to that. But we've shifted from that into a discussion of how to cultivate certain modes of practice, how to think about social spaces in which we interact with each other and how to construct those spaces, and then our own burdens and responsibilities to ourselves and to others that we need to accept in order to participate in those spaces. And we can describe this in different ways, instrumentalist, pragmatist, ways that I think we're both inclined to go here. But I think that is an important shift. And maybe one way to make some of this conversation specific and concrete is just to pause and say something about the recent Whoopi Goldberg case, where it's been interpreted as sort of a microcosm of our larger confusions about race, where she remarked, just to recall, that the Holocaust really wasn't about race, because it was white people doing things to other white people. And it runs up against, one way of sorting people where there's kind of a black category and a white one, and questions of ethnicity, religion, Jewishness don't, they have to fit in one or the other box. So maybe there's something that you can say about the way that race talk and a conception of race seems to have functioned both in what will be said, but also kind of the reactions to it.
I can try. I will confess, I did not attend with care to the Whoopi Goldberg affair for reasons I'll share with you in a second. They're not interesting reasons, but I'll make them articulate. But first, I want to flag that there is a nice. You've given me an opportunity to operationalize some of what I said a second ago. So my answer to your last question was very abstract and pointing to all the complications and all of that. But the punchline was, it is important to cultivate certain kinds of dispositions, to create space for certain kinds of practices and all of that. What does that actually mean? One thing it can mean is something that I did in a couple of classes that I've taught recently on racial justice and stuff like that. We did a couple of units on Marshall Rosenberg's nonviolent communication strategy, right? To give people tools, right? Not concepts or principles, but practical tools for managing their participation in communicative interaction so that they can lower the temperature, so that they can create space for people to hear what they're saying instead of responding to the kind of person they think they are, right? So that's a concrete set of tools that people can use to manage those interactions. How does that, and the tools involve things like disciplining yourself in your interactions to focus on the words instead of on making generalizations about the speaker, right? When you say that kind of thing, you're a certain kind of person. No, probably don't want to do that. Instead, say, when you say that kind of thing, here's what follows from it, right? Separate the speaker from the utterance. Why does that bear on the Whoopi Goldberg affair? Because one of the things that happened in that affair was a complete demonstration of the thing that nonviolent communication means to get at, right? Whoopi Goldberg said a thing, people decided she was a kind of person because she said a thing that conflicted with the way other people thought about the thing, right? And the conflict is rooted in some of the complexities we started our conversation with. There are different regimes of race thinking. Race thinking gets mobilized differently in different settings. For some people, race talk is about Negroes and white people. That's all it is. For other people, like me, race talk is about something much more capacious that has to involve anti-Semitism and Jewishness and Europeanness and all. Whoopi was using a different dialect of race talk. It ain't about Negroes, it's not about race. That's probably too limited a view. But instead of saying to her, that's probably too limited a view, Some people said, she's an anti-Semite, or whatever they said. I didn't attend to it. I don't know what they said. I presume they thought she was some kind of racist or Holocaust denier or something. I began by saying I didn't attend with care to it. Here's why. One of the things we have to do when we think about race and these flammable social constructs and principles of social differentiation is engage carefully with the mechanisms of opinion management and production, right? The mills of content production and reproduction, right? There is a way in which once that kind of dispute enters the public sphere is mediated by mass media anyway, it just becomes utterly unproductive, and it's very hard to drag it back into the realm of productivity. One of the things we can do, people like me, I have the privilege of being in a classroom periodically. I can say to my students, here's a teachable moment. Here's a thing we can do, or a thing we can talk about. That's not how it plays out on, I mentioned TMZ to my students the other day, and they were like, what are you talking about? So even TMZ is old now, I guess. But that's not the way these things play out in public. They often play out in utterly unproductive ways that give us very few resources for self-edification or edification of others. So I didn't attend with care to it. But from what I understand of it, it is almost a paradigm case of the challenges that nonviolent communication means to get at, and the way those challenges are bound up with the difficulties of race talk and race thinking.
Thank you. Yes, and I think your point about engaging carefully with the mills of content creation is precisely the challenge that we face in our social media TikTok milieu that we're in. And I think one way to wrap up perhaps is just to get your quick thoughts on the tagline of the Institute for Social Justice, which you see behind me, One Just World. And we're interested to hear what that might mean for you. Can you hear it?
Oh, well, it is a rich tagline full of possibility. There are lots of things one could say about it. To me, it represents a kind of aspiration and challenge, right? The world will never be monolithic. What makes the world wonderful when it is wonderful is that it is not monolithic. There is great richness and diversity and lots of different people doing lots of different things. And so the oneness of a world like that cannot be about sameness. The oneness of a world like that cannot be about flattening out differences so that we have no grounds for conflict. The oneness of a world like that has to be about cultivating in ourselves the capacity to manage the inevitable differences and conflicts in ways that are productive and intelligent and nonviolent and enriching, instead of being violent and damaging. So oneness is an incredible and wonderful and valuable aspiration, as is justice. I've said nothing about that. But it's an aspiration that has to be balanced with the rich possibility of human difference. Otherwise, what's the point?
Excellent words to close on. Well, I'd like to thank you, Professor Taylor. This has been a very illuminating conversation, and I hope that we can have you back before long to get into other topics like justice and whiteness and other things. But again, let me thank you. There's a link below us or above us somewhere to your book, Race, a Philosophical Introduction, and other resources that people can use to go into greater depth on the things we talked about here. But thank you, Dr. Taylor, and have a great day.
You're very welcome. It's my great pleasure. It's a thrill to be in conversation with you again. Thanks so much.
Okay.